Hey everybody, welcome to episode 25 of Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie Reread. My name is Bina007. I'll be your host as we cover Hercule Poirot's Christmas, despite the fact that it's the middle of summer, originally published in 1938. And joining me today is Pat.
Hi there, also known as 2.0 on the Discord.
Absolutely. Join us to discuss Agatha Christie and much else on the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord server. Google VOK podcast to find the link to join. Okay, as usual, folks, we're going to discuss this in a spoiler-free manner and talk about the context, a little bit about the cast, some of the plotting in a spoiler-free way, whether it holds up to the modern reader and adaptations. And then after the end credits music, we're going to get into the solution of the novel. But to whet your appetite, if you have not yet read this novel, this is a proper locked room mystery, and the first that Agatha Christie has written. She's done others that are sort of a locked house in terms of there's a certain cast of characters in a certain space. So you pretty much have a defined set of people who are suspects. But this is a genuine locked room mystery with a real twist at the end. And in her dedication to this novel, Agatha writes, "My dear James, you have always been one of the most faithful and kindly of my readers, and I was therefore seriously perturbed when I received from you a word of criticism. You complained that my murders were getting too refined, anemic, in fact. You yearned for a, quote, good violent murder with lots of blood, end quote. A murder where there was no doubt about its being a murder. So this is your special story written for you. I hope it may please your affectionate sister-in-law, Agatha." So this is a locked room mystery with tons of blood, a real gory end for the victim, and to a certain extent, a foreshadowing of then there were none in structure because we have the chapters by day and the point of view of different characters as they assemble in the house to celebrate Christmas, where the locked room murder is going to take place. Pat, was this your first time reading this or a rereading? And how did you find it in the relativity of all the other Poirots we've read so far?
First time reading it. Didn't enjoy it as much as others, but it had its own attractions. I can't talk too much about the ways it appealed to me until the spoiler section, really, because I felt I guessed the murderer relatively soon. And I think compared to quite a few, I think Christie dropped a lot more clues in this one that I picked up on much earlier. So
yeah, I think it's quite ham-fisted in its cluing too. We can get into it in the spoiler-filled section, but I felt this was, in a lot of respects, quite ham-fisted. And to me, this is definitely tier 2 Christie, bordering on tier 3. I mean, for me, it's not as bad as Murder in Mesopotamia, but it's kind of approaching that. It's like a 2.5.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'll always love a Poirot and I'll always love a Christie, but I feel like the tortured nature of getting to this locked room mystery forces her to do things that I find a little bit silly and a little bit implausible. So
well, I think like the thing is, like, she generally writes a good plot. You know, her outlines are generally solid, and I think that's why like the TV series was so successful, because they've adapted it. And okay, they might have trimmed a few members of the cast and things like that, but like the bones of a good story are always there, you know, and I think you can't really deny that. That's one of the reasons why she was so popular at the time. You might not be happy with the way she's written some stuff, and some of the dialogue might have dated and things like that, but the bones of the plot are usually pretty sound. And I found that with this one, you know. I think I'm with you in that it's not as good as a lot of the other stuff, but I think that's probably down to the quality of the way she's told the story, part of it being dated, rather than the plot. I mean, I thought it was okay in that respect. I didn't think it was too bad. So.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get into it. And let's maybe start with, as usual, a bit of historical context. We're going to talk a little bit about Agatha Christie, you know, being in her happier and more productive years. She's in a wonderful second marriage. She's very settled in her life, very successful. But the world, by contrast, is not. This would have been released in the winter of 1938, a year which saw many wonderful innovations. We had Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs released, which is pretty epic. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We also had the first nylon bristle toothbrush, I realised.
Oh my God.
I know. Can you imagine it's that old?
I feel I've got loads of posts to put on the Today I Learned section.
I know.
the Vassals of Kingsgrave Discord now. This is great.
Exactly. But very sadly, it was also a year where we had Adolf Hitler's Germany force the Anschluss with Austria.
Mm-hmm.
We have Second Sino-Japanese War. We have the first edition of Superman in Action Comics, #1.
Oh, wow.
I know, it's kind of weird, isn't it? Because you have all these things that I think of as incredibly modern at the same time as all these really heroic things. And maybe the most relevant for this novel, we have the continuation of the Spanish Civil War and in some ways an acceleration of it. And you start to see air power used. So bombing from the air was obviously a major part of the Spanish Civil War. Most of us know it through Picasso's Guernica. Alicante was bombed by fascist rebels, 313 people dead. So these are the sorts of things that would have been appearing in the press, would have formed, I guess, the sort of the background of this novel. But I think it is really interesting. You know, this is the time of air power. This is the time of Hitler rising to power. This is in a sense, a very modern year, a year of modernity, of new technology, maybe rather ominously. And it is the year, obviously, of the Sudeten crisis, where the West did not step up and defend the Sudetenland. And the Munich Agreement was signed, so we had peace in our time. So maybe it's all right.
Yeah, well, I don't think so. But, with hindsight, we know that wasn't the case. I think that would be one of the points I would make about the context of this story. I felt that, and again, we're coming at this with the benefit of hindsight, the Spanish Civil War was given quite light treatment. The characters who've experienced it as part of this story are like, well, it's just war, and I think that, it's quite an admirable character trait that they've got, in that they seem to be quite robust individuals. They're not emotionally damaged by all the experiences that they've been through. But I think we know that wasn't the case, that in reality, like with Picasso's Guernica, this was a tremendously traumatic period of time. Like you said, this was one of the first uses of air power in sort of like mass bombing.
And of civilians, right?
Yeah.
Like weaponizing civilians. It's kind of interesting in the context of the film Oppenheimer as well. And I was just thinking that what would you have been doing in England for Christmas? As you were buying your gifts of Christmas for your family, would you have been worried that your dad or your uncle or your brother or your son was maybe going to be called up to a war? Would you have been reading daily in the papers? I mean, this novel was published basically 5 weeks after Kristallnacht in Germany. So as much as you might have been oblivious to the rise of anti-Semitism and violence in Germany, I'm thinking that by then you probably aren't. I would hope you're not. And so maybe there is something to the popularity of Agatha Christie and the escapism. Yes. How am I pronouncing that? This idea that you're in a very safe world, and maybe there's something really comforting in the idea that of a locked room mystery in particular, that the violence is going to be incredibly safely contained in this one room with this one cast of characters. And I can have Hercule Poirot come in and solve it and tie everything with a nice bow at the end when the world is falling apart. Maybe that speaks to the sales. And, the next novel we were just talking about is Murder is Easy, set in a lovely, quaint English village. And there must have been something incredibly comforting about just escaping into a Christie at a time of civil and actual war.
I mean, I'm curious about something as well, because these books continued to be written and published throughout the war. And I'm always wondering, like, how did people get hold of them? I can understand how in America, where, they didn't have to go through the Blitz. So the things could still happen. People could still publish books. But, what was happening in the UK? I mean, how were these books after? Because I would have imagined that this one would have been almost like the last one that would have been published before Britain got dragged into the war.
Yeah, well, we'll get into this a little bit when we talk about later books and how paper shortages did or didn't impact things, but it definitely was part of it later on. But for the moment, we're not in the war, and actually it is, mass publications absolutely fine. So far so good in that respect. But we do have some nice quotes from the books on context. So if we start with the Spanish Civil War, there's quite a long passage early on about that, where there is a character who is Spanish, a Spanish lady who's come over to this English village where the murder's going to take place. And the quote is, "Pilar's politics seemed to be rather vague. In the village where she came from," she explained, "nobody had paid very much attention to the war. It has not been near us, you understand. The mayor, he is, of course, an officer of the government, so he is for the government. And the priest is for General Franco. But most of the people are busy with their vines and the land, and they have not time to go into these questions. So there isn't any fighting around you? And Pilar said that there had not been. But then I drove in a car all across the country, and there was much destruction. And I saw a bomb drop, and it blew up a car. Yes, and another destroyed a house. It was very exciting.
Yeah, well, this is the point I'm making. It's almost a bit too blasé, and I think,
Yeah, exactly. But it is interesting that I think there's some deep truth in there, actually, that even in a time of war, it's probably psychologically quite healthy if you can just focus on your own life and just getting through that rather than focusing on
coping mechanism. Yeah.
There were some other things that made me laugh, though, in terms of historical context, because slimming, which I always thought of as a very modern industry, right, the wellness industry and the slimming industry, makes itself known. So Mr. George was very red in the face, gobbling his food. He was without tasting it. He'd get a stroke one day if he wasn't careful, Mrs. George. Mrs. George wasn't eating, slimming as likely as not.
Yes.
And I thought, oh my God, that's really funny that like just the concept of slimming was there, you know.
And just as a side point to come back to what we were doing at the start, about why we like this and why we thought it was maybe not as high on our list as some of the others. I think it's not got as much humour. And I think Christie has got quite a sly sort of social observational eye.
Yeah, she's very satirical, isn't she?
Yeah, but it's missing from this. And I think one of the few instances that we get it, we get it less than a handful of times in this book, I would say. It was maybe like 2 or 3. And one of them was when the butler Trevelyan is going round serving dinner, and he is really caustic. And this is one of his passages, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. The judgment of the servant who thinks he's superior to the master. Exactly.
Yeah, and I enjoy Christie when she's writing stuff like that, and I like to see plenty of it in her books. You know, and this one didn't have it. You know, it was much sparser. You know,
yeah.
And I think
there's also a bit of social satire, I think, in the voice of Hercule Poirot, who I often think is kind of mediating what Agatha Christie thinks, and it's really funny again because people think she's this sort of twee English village, oldie worldy heritage person. But Hercule Poirot is really annoyed at the fact that this house is really cold and it's got this wood fire that isn't really working. He says, cautiously, he edged his own chair nearer to the blazing logs, though he was of the opinion that the opportunity for roasting the soles of one's feet, like some medieval torture, did not offset the cold draft that swirled around the back of his shoulders.
Yeah.
Colonel Johnson, Chief Constable of Middleshire, might be of the opinion that nothing could beat a wood fire, but Hercule Poirot was of the opinion that central heating could and did every time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we've you sort of like, you're talking about the age of modernity. You know, here we are. Hercule Poirot is very attached to his radiators. So
yeah, exactly. And I love the idea that people might think of Hercule Poirot as fuddy-duddy and old-fashioned, and you know, but actually he is a man who just likes convenience and luxury, and I think that's very much Agatha Christie, and I'm very much of the same attitude. And I can just imagine Hercule Poirot using a modern nylon toothbrush as well. Efficiency, my dear Hastings. In terms of the Christiverse, the character of Colonel Johnson of Middleshire appeared in 3-act tragedy. Bit of a deep cut there for you to remember, from 1935. And they do mention that case in part 3 of this novel. And it is a little bit meta, actually. I think Agatha Christie does have a little bit of fun, right? There's a point where he says, "Do you mean to tell me, Superintendent, that this is one of those damn cases you get in a detective story, where a man is killed in a locked room by some apparently supernatural agency?" So I think Agatha Christie's playing with the idea that she's trying out this format of the locked room mystery, and she's winking at us and saying, "I know this is a little bit silly and contrived, but let's see. You know I'm cool at this, so let's see how good I am at creating this puzzle." Maybe into a bit of an outline of plot. So basically, the family or a family are gathering in a country house for Christmas. The family is run by a guy called Simeon Lee, who is a very old man. He's a millionaire, and he's basically a total shit. And it's really funny that he's almost like the male equivalent of the evil sadistic mother in Appointment with Death.
Yeah.
So he controls people through money.
Christie seems to be a lot lighter on Simeon Lee. I mean, you're right. They're almost identical in that they're controlling people through money. But Simeon Lee seems to be portrayed more as a mischievous character who's not really that bad. He's just got a bit of devilment in him. Whereas Mrs. Boynton comes across as somebody who's malevolent. You know, she is.
Oh, I don't know. I think they both come across as really horrid. I think Simeon Lee comes across as an absolute nightmare.
Well,
and that
like,
she's really harsh on him in his personal life and how he treated his wives. And I do not think she gets him off the hook. I think we've definitely read that very differently.
There's a quote from one of his daughters, and I know that we're going to get on to what his daughters-in-law think of him, but Lydia Lee describes him as diabolically impish. And it's almost like he's being treated as almost like a naughty little boy. But
No,
by the way
I don't
people
get
are
that
talking
at
about
all.
him.
I don't get that at all.
Across?
No, I didn't.
All
But
right.
that's the joy of Agatha Christie, right? We get different things from it.
Well,
I did get the impression though, and we've had this before, haven't we? Where there's one or two books that follow each other, where you can almost feel that she had a good idea and she was sort of working it out differently and writing it in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
And I really feel this pairs very well with Appointment with Death, because
I think so,
you know, it is a family that's controlled I mean, actually, almost I feel in Appointment with Death, it's more controlled psychologically. Because here, none of the kids are really psychologically controlled by him. They all hate him. It's just
he has a looser degree of control over the children than Mrs. Boynton has over her children, and I think there's a psychological element of that. But I don't want to be defending Simeon Lee because he's not a nice person. But I mean, they do talk about him being openly generous for people who are in need and things like that. And anyway, it came across to me as he was more a bored old man having a little bit of sport with his children and trying to get them to stick up for themselves, rather than somebody who, like, I said this when we were talking about Mrs. Boynton when we did the Appointment of Death one. I get the feeling that she's almost portrayed as some sort of, the essence of evil. She's some horrific monster. And I think that degree of psychological control she has over her family comes across like that. Whereas, I don't think Simeon Lee, maybe he's just not as clever, No,
and I think there is something where I think when you read all of Agatha Christie's novels as a whole, and we're going to get there with Spades in And Then There Were None, that she has a respect for psychological evil and psychological manipulation in a way that she doesn't for just sort of mere financial or logistical control. And I think you're right. I think they are different categories of evil victim of murder. So, dear listener, if you haven't read this, basically it should come as no surprise that the family are going to gather around their dear old dad, Simeon Lee, for Christmas. And he is going to be the victim who is found brutally murdered. A very immobile old man locked in his room. They have to break the door to get in. There's no apparent way into the room. The window is open, but just an inch, but with a safety nail for children so that you can't open it more. And there's just no apparent way someone could get in. So how was this murder committed? This very brutal, gory, bloody, disgusting death.
They do make they make a big deal of that security screw as well on the window. It's old but quite firm. The window hasn't been, that window hasn't been opened beyond that security screw for years.
Yeah. So it's a really good setup. And the challenge and the joy for the Christie reader is to figure out, obviously someone did get in the room to murder this man in a very gory way. Why? It feels like it should be a member of the extended family and the people who were living there. Hercule Poirot is a house guest. Is he going to detect the murderer? Let's do some character stuff. So Hercule Poirot obviously remains an absolute badass. He has a conversation with the superintendent who's investigating the murder, who also has a moustache. And he's looking at it with great attention. He says, "It is true that your moustache is superb. Tell me, do you use for it a special pomade?" Pomade? Good Lord, no. What do you use? Use nothing at all. It just grows. Poirot sighed. "Ah, you are favoured by nature." He caressed his own luxuriant black moustaches, then sighed. "However expensive the preparation, to restore the natural colour does somewhat impoverish the quality of the hair." So we get once again an admission that he is dyeing his tash, and it's destroying the quality of it. So,
and I was quite pleased that you'd fished that quote out, because again, this is coming back to this being a less humorous novel. I mean, I went through this. I was trying to scour it for the Poirot being Poirot bit for Xander, and I couldn't come across one. And I think this is
there's
it.
very little. That's pretty much it, right? That is the only Xander moment.
Yeah, this is it. This is all we've got from the whole book. So I mean, I'm disappointed in that respect. But this bit is hilarious. You get the feeling Poirot. You can always see yourself. Poirot's sitting there in the room, eyeing the guy's moustache jealously. He's there going, "Oh, how did he get it to be like that?"
Exactly. So joining Poirot on the detective side of the list, we've got Colonel Johnson, who we mentioned before, the Chief Constable of Middleshire, and we also have the guy who's really going to be more on the scene in the house, really doing the investigating. In fact, he was in the house just before the murder, collecting a charitable donation before Christmas, and that is Superintendent Sugden, he of the beautiful moustaches, who's the investigating police officer. We then move to the people who live in the house. So we've got Simeon Lee, as we said, the old millionaire. Really interesting, as you say, as a character.
He's not the same level as Mrs. Boynton. I think he is more of a caricature. And I think we can argue over degrees of evil, but he's not a nice guy.
No, but there is control. So this is a quote from Lydia, who you mentioned before. He's got a son called Alfred and the wife Lydia, which is very similar to Nadine Boynton asking or wanting her husband to leave and being frustrated that the husband won't leave. So again, it's very much a sort of an echo or another reworking of Appointment with Death. As far as money goes, your father is very generous, I admit, said Lydia, but in return, he expects us to behave like slaves. That's the word I used. You are his slave, Alfred. If we have planned to go away and father suddenly wishes us not to go, you cancel your arrangements and remain without a murmur. If the whim takes him to send us away, we go. We have no lives of our own, no independence. And I kind of feel that could absolutely just be Nadine Boynton talking about Mrs. Boynton. So he exercises control for sure, maybe not as easily, but it is there.
And there is a bit he exercises over Alfred because when his sons grow up, he has plans for them all. And one of the sons, Harry, decides to go off and do his own thing. And as a result, that changes Simeon's plans for his sons. And Alfred, who was quite looking forward to joining the army, now has to come into the family business, and he just does it because, that's expected of him. And you do get the feeling that, Simeon Lee has a degree of control over Alfred Lee that that Mrs. Boynton had over her children.
And therefore over Lydia Lee. So so let's go through the sons. There's Alfred, as he said, who had to give up the army and run the family business. We've got a second son called George Lee, who's an MP, a member of parliament. He's a politician. He's corpulent. He's greedy. He needs a lot more money despite his very generous allowance. He's married to a wife called Magdalene, who's 20 years younger than him. And he just basically needs to touch up his dad for more money, effectively. So he's got motive for murder, just as they all do. There's another son called David Lee, who was an artist. He's very nervous and anxious. He's got shaking hands.
Yeah, and I think he's traumatized from his childhood because
very anxious.
And they make a point of the fact that Simeon was not a good husband, and that David was lent on a lot by his mother, and a lot of her anxiety about the relationship, has transferred through to him, and he's carried it forward. And so much so that he sort of left the family home as soon as he got the chance, didn't he? Made his own life away from it.
Yeah, but is very, very loyal to the mother called Hilda. Quote, she was so sweet, Hilda, and so patient, lying there, often in pain, but bearing it, enduring everything. And when I think of my father, his face darkened, bringing all that misery into her life, humiliating her, boasting of his love affairs, constantly unfaithful to her, and never troubling to conceal it. So he's very loyal to the mum, and we are taken to understand throughout the book that Simeon Lee was a serial cheat. He didn't bother to cover it up. He had lots of illegitimate children, and that he still fancies himself a ladies' man. I mean, he can barely walk independently, but he's still creeping on his daughter-in-laws and commenting on their appearance and being really, really inappropriate.
You were saying this in one of the previous casts, and I think it holds true. I think again the wives are more interesting, and Poirot actually makes this point. Poirot says about them, the wives of these Lees had married were an interesting study. And there's the bit later on in the book where he's going through the characters of all of the individuals, and all of the wives have all got, interesting character traits. And I did feel that the men were a bit, almost one-dimensionally drawn. You've got Alfred, the dutiful son, and he doesn't really do much more than be dutiful. Even George, who you've talked about as the MP who needs more money, he's just really a bit tight. And it's his wife, Magdalene, who's really pushing him for money. And then David, who's just a bit traumatized. But again, you've got his wife next to him who's carrying him through a lot of the problems he's got. And she's the one who's trying to establish it with the family. And I found that the interviews that Poirot's having with them after the murder, the men were just much more matter of fact, whereas the women had different gears and levels to them. I mean, the interview with Magdalene I thought was like really instructive because, again, this contrasts with Appointment with Death. In Appointment with Death, all the family started covering up for each other because they didn't know who'd done it and they were worried that one of them would get topped in, whereas in this one, they all lie by omission. They're all like, Poirot interviews them, and Magdalene straight away is like, well, George didn't really have a reason, but David had this reason, and Alfred had this reason, and Harry had this reason, and then she just neglects to mention the fact that, Simeon had a go at them, and
yeah, but I mean, I think that's all a bit weak in a way. That's why I don't really like the novel, because the reason is they all want the money, right? I mean, it's not that complicated. But you're right, the women are interesting, and even Simeon comments on it. I think he at one point says, Hilda Lee, she has force. Like he almost prizes his own kids and admires their wives, whether they're because they're beautiful or because they're bold. I mean, he likes people. We'll get to Pilar in a bit. Let's just quickly do Harry Lee, the final son, the black sheep, the prodigal. He's the one that sort of went off, was wild, got into debt, and was always cabling back for money, traveled the world, and he's now turned up back for Christmas, presumably also after money as well, which is putting the dutiful sons' noses out of joint because, they're the ones who've always done the right thing, and now this one's coming back and is apparently the favourite. But I always think when I read of these dissipated young men who are quite charming, quite good looking, but feckless, I always think of Agatha Christie's handsome elder brother who went away to Africa and got into all sorts of trouble and died fairly young. And, she was forced to write to save her family effectively because this one was just so pathetic. But she often has a soft spot for these prodigal sons. And I think that really, it's still coming through in 1938.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she does write. Yeah, does write these adventurous men. They might be a bit dim, but they've usually got something to soften them.
Yeah, I suppose she married one in a way, but even in the happiness of her second marriage, she can still think back on them fondly in a way.
Yeah.
And just as we leave the family members, who I guess are all the suspects, it's worth pointing out a key character trait of that family. We learn that Simeon Lee basically started off in business in diamonds in Africa, diamond mines. And he says of himself, I waited once 15 years to get even with a man who'd done me an injury. That's another characteristic of the Lees. They don't forget. They'll avenge a wrong if they have to wait years to do it. A man swindled me, and I waited 15 years till I saw my chance, and then I struck. I ruined him, cleaned him right out. So not only does the entire family have a motive to kill him for the money and to get out from under his control, presumably there are people out in the world who have been held in business by this man because he has not conducted himself well. So everyone's basically a suspect. And then I guess there's sort of a couple of other characters we should go through. There's Pilar Estravados, this mysterious Spanish lady who claims to be Simeon's granddaughter, and she's come up from Spain given the Civil War, and he seems incredibly taken with her. There's also Stephen Farr, who is the son of Simeon's former business partner. He's actually our first point of view, coming back to England, back from South Africa. Apparently hates England. He's 40 years old, and he's going to go and look up his dad's old business partner. And he kind of fancies Pilar, meets her on the train, and they're going to the same place. So you've got this weird house where you've got the family, you've got this superintendent who's there just before the murder, you've got Poirot, and then you've got this very handsome or pretty Spanish lady and a 40-year-old fairly handsome guy also there, as well as all the old sort of butlers and footmen who are silently and secretly judging as well. So that's the cast of characters in the house. Did any of them stand out to you? I mean, you said already that you thought the women were far more interesting than the men. Anything else you want to say about the characters?
Well, to start with, if we go back to when Stephen Farr and Pilar first meet on the train, I thought that was quite an interesting passage because we're seeing it from their point of view, and they don't like England. They find it dark and dreary, and they say everybody is like quite glum. There's nobody there. Everybody's uptight. These are caricatures of English people. Stiff upper lip, not very friendly. And I almost thought there was an element because they were describing the sort of the countryside being dreary and London being crowded and dirty. And there was I was thinking this pathetic fallacy all the way through this. Christie is telling us that there's something wrong here, by the way that these characters who have come in from outside of England, are perceiving it. They don't like it, People aren't being nice to each other. It made me think of Hamlet. I'm thinking there's something rotten in the state of Denmark here because she is very negative about the whole thing. And the only time that she's ever positive is when Stephen Farr's talking about South Africa. He's going, "Oh, this is a bright, sunny country, a land of opportunity. There's loads going on." And I was just wondering, was this a reflection of what Christie was thinking herself? Is she thinking, England is quite tired and,
I thought exactly the same, Pat, because I thought, gosh, this is a woman who had a pretty crap marriage in suburban Surrey, and just it was not a happy time for her. She escaped into this amazing second marriage where she was traveling through the Middle East with her archaeologist husband and producing these amazing books in luxury travel in the Middle East, all these beautiful sunny places, really fascinating places. And then presumably because of the war and because of things becoming more hostile, probably did have to come home and be more constrained in where she was traveling. This was not a safe place to travel in the world anymore, and probably did feel a little bit like, oh my God, I'm back in this country and it's so gloomy and the weather's so crap. And I was trying to think, is she trying to subvert a Christmas story? Because Christmas stories always have to have happy, lovely snow and the chestnuts roasting on an open fire. And what does she do in this story?
Yeah,
she moans about the weather and she says, chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Give me central heating and radiator any day of the week.
Yeah, and she's definitely subverted it because she's had the happy family Christmas that Simeon Lee keeps banging on about, and the head of the family gets come in. So yes, she's definitely done that. But I mean, for me, I was thinking of it in two ways. I was thinking, firstly, this is obviously a reflection of Christie's feeling, but I also thought this is heavily foreshadowing that everything is not going well in this country at the moment, and we're going to get a murder. It's a bit blunt, but there it is. So anyway,
so that's why I always find it funny when people think of Agatha Christie as writing these sort of twee English village life heritage things. I'm like, Agatha Christie hated twee English village life. Whenever she could, she traveled to somewhere far more interesting and sunny. Yeah. And she always, where possible, talks about efficiency and modernity. And isn't it lovely to have wall-to-wall carpeting and central heating? So she really was not an old twee heritage person at all. She was very cutting edge.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's. Oh, sorry.
The other thing, then, the other point I wanted to make was I thought that Pilar and Magdalene Lee, they bore comparisons because I got the idea that they were relatively close in age, and they're both young women who are trying to make their way in the world. So Pilar has come over from Spain because her parents are dead, and she's, Simeon Lee's brought his granddaughter back to England to look after her. And Magdalene, you get the feeling she's hooked up with George, who is considerably older than her, and you're very much thinking of Magdalene almost as a trophy bride. And she's got, because she's very beautiful, but she also has debts. We're told straight away that she has a stack of bills that she tries to organize and then gives up because there's just too many of them, and there's that quote that Pilar says, "The world is harder on women," and again, this is all coming through. And I thought that, again, if you compare them, Pilar is very direct. She's very plain speaking. She tells people straight up what she's thinking, and she's quite honest with that. She's unapologetic. Whereas Magdalene, I quite enjoyed her as a character because she's interesting. She's quite artful, very clever with her use of language, and guarded in what she says and how she comes across. And you're almost trying to second guess. You're trying to read the subtext of whatever it is Magdalene's saying. So I thought it was interesting because I could see Pilar was trying to project that she was a strong person, whereas Magdalene was almost playing on the idea of being a weaker woman. She's trying to leverage it to her advantage. And then the other thing
I think from the sound of it is you enjoyed reading this a lot more than I did, because I genuinely didn't connect with any of these characters.
Yeah.
And
Well,
apart from
I wouldn't
Poirot,
say,
and even
yeah.
Poirot wasn't as Poirot-ish as normal, so it was kind of like.
I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say I connected with them, but I think there's probably a bit where, you're probably enjoying finding out more about the Boyntons, whereas these people are much plainer studies.
Yeah, no, I didn't enjoy. I didn't enjoy the setting or the characters, and in the end, I didn't enjoy the plot, which is why I don't like it as a book. Okay, so let's then maybe move into what has or hasn't held up well by modern standards or to a first-time reader. I'm pleased to say this is a book that does not contain anti-Semitism, but it does obviously contain huge amounts of anti-foreigner, anti-Spanish in particular sentiment, which focuses very heavily on Pilar. We don't actually get the D word, the pejorative for Spanish people that we got in a previous book, but we do get lots of sort of exoticism and whatever Orientalism is for people from Southern Europe. It's pretty hard to read, actually. So the first passage, which I think is really horrible, is the sad pride at proud. And what makes it worse is I think Agatha Christie's trying to be flattering.
Yeah.
And she says, quote, "The sad, proud eyes of the South. It was all wrong that this girl should be sitting in this train among these dull, drab-looking people. All wrong that she should be going into the dreary Midlands of England. She should have been on a balcony, a rose between her lips, a piece of black lace draping her proud head, and there should have been dust and heat and the smell of blood, the smell of the bull ring in the air. She should be somewhere splendid, not squeezed into the corner of a third-class carriage." So it's kind of like she's trying to say this person is special and kind of really interesting, but it's doing it in such a kind of completely, exoticized way. It's just really great. Like, you wouldn't write like that now. You wouldn't be talking about the smell of the bull ring.
I mean, I don't doubt that was probably, as you said, Agatha's trying to write as romantically evocative a scene as she can, But did you feel that could you almost forgive Agatha because what she's trying to do is that's the way Stephen Farr is seeing the situation, and that's a description of a man at that time looking at Pilar rather than what the narrator is genuinely thinking.
I think I am one who says you've got to distinguish between when Agatha thinks something and when she's trying to tell us something about a character. But I do think this is Agatha. She does it so often with Spanish people. And I think it is ignorance, because she is trying to be flattering in almost all the cases, but I think it's pretty. I think this case in particular is Agatha being Agatha through Stephen Farr. I think later she's trying to tell us about characters and show certain characters to be small-minded. So a good example is, I think, when she's trying to show the small-mindedness of Magdalene, she says, Magdalene says, "I can't help feeling that the manner of my father-in-law's death was somehow significant. It was so very un-English." And Poirot says to her, "Oh, the Spanish touch, you think?" And Magdalene says, "Well, they are cruel, aren't they? All those bullfights and things."
Yeah.
So obviously Magdalene's trying to finger Pilar and is using her ethnicity to say the fact that the death was so bloody means it was the Spaniard. Does that mean that that's really how Magdalene feels about Spanish people, or she's just trying to, use the evidence to point in a direction? But I think what Agatha is saying is there is something kind of quite small-minded that's the thing that she goes to. So to me, that's a much more layered bit of racism than the first thing, which I think is much more straightforward.
Well, I'm going to come in the defense here, because I did feel that although all the language points that you're making are valid, I did think that Agatha, with Pilar, she's representing a refugee, and I did think she came across as getting that quite accurately. Like I'm somebody who as a child was moved around. Like my dad's in construction and he traveled all over the UK to follow where the work was. So there's a bit where Pilar starts stressing her English heritage, even though she's disappointed in the country. And I just felt like, I'm going back to my childhood, that whenever you're somewhere new, you're always trying to stress your similarities to try and fit in, to try. And I thought Agatha captured that, Pilar is tremendously proud of where she comes from and she's always talking about it. but there are times where she's like or when she's on the defensive, she's always stressing the fact that her mum was English.
Well, let's come back to that in the spoiler
English.
fill section, because I think there's interesting stuff we can say about that, but I need to get into the plot. But I think you are right, and I think you are fair, and I think that it's something I always try and stress with Agatha Christie, right? That there are layers to how we should read the racism, that sometimes it's not as straightforward as saying this is Agatha Christie being offensive. She's
Agatha
making
Christie portraying offensive people.
Yeah, exactly. And she does it. I mean, I think that the best example of the latter, which is her knowing, like, deliberately trying to make someone else out to be small-minded, is when she says, Lydia says, my poor Alfred, he's so British. He doesn't really like Lee money going to a Spanish subject. And so we're meant to read in that small-mindedness something quite narrow and pathetic about Alfred.
Yeah.
Rather than Agatha's own attitude, right? So, I mean, I think, like you say, there are layers and there's nuances in what's going on there. There is one adaptation of this story in the ITV David Suchet Agatha Christie's Poirot that was released in 1994. It's pretty faithful to the novel, although some of the characters have been cut out and sort of made more concise. It is, I think, a very ordinary adaptation. I found it really quite boring, actually. And I think it comes down to what you said about there not being much humor in the book and it just being very logistical and technical. And how did we do this locked room? And it just all feels a bit...
Yeah, and I watched this Poirot adaptation in my usual manner with these when I'm preparing for it. I sort of like flicked through it. And they made something of the central heating, I you almost feel like they've had to be creative. They're like, let's try and introduce a bit of humor into this because this is quite a dry, compared to some of the other ones, this is quite a dry book. So
we've got to try and zhuzh it up in some way.
Yeah.
So as we come to the end of this sort of, spoiler-free part of the conversation, what's the recommendation? If people haven't read it yet and are listening, do we recommend they read this book? Because I'm not entirely sure I would recommend they read it, but do you think it's better than I'm maybe giving it credit for?
No, I think you're probably being fair. I think like this might be something that we might want to sit down and do at a later stage where we sort of like we rank these. But I think by the very fact that this is tier 2 Christie, I would say like unless you're an Agatha Christie fan, I wouldn't bother. I think you need to read tier 1s first. So you've got to do like Murder on the Orient Express. You've got to do Death on the Nile. You've got to do even Mysteries of Lutain, and then there were none. I was thinking more of the Poirots, but like this isn't. I think this is more for people who are more interested in trying to read more Poirots, and I would imagine that like I haven't read anywhere near as many Christies as you have, and I would place this in the sort of the bottom half of the ones that I've read, and I would recommend you read the top half. So
definitely. Okay, well, listener, there you go. There you have it. Unless you want a deep cut, maybe one to avoid. I would say, however, listener, if you want to listen to a really good podcast series about Agatha Christie, really check out All About Agatha. It's done by 2 American podcasters, sadly one of whom's passed away, but it's still going on. And they read them all in order, including all the short stories, and they did rank them. They had quite an interesting ranking system around characters and plot mechanics, and again, deducting points for being regressive or progressive. If you haven't listened, Pat, it's really phenomenal.
Yeah,
all about Agatha, and
I'll look into it.
They do a lot of research. They get great people on, so that is really interesting because they do have a ranking system, and maybe we should rank them at the end because we may or may not disagree with them. I think it sounds like for both of us, Blue Train's going to be higher up the rankings than for most. But I'd really recommend that.
I think like the only other thing I would say about this is I think it is quite a good period piece. So if you're interested in finding out more about this sort of like pre-war era, pre-World War II era, this does portray and the English country house. I wouldn't say it's Downton Abbey because we're not talking about the upper class. These are upper middle class people. They're nouveau riche. There's a lot of wealth around this, and there's little details, like when Trevelyan's going around the dinner table and he's commenting about how the footman's messed up the ordering of serving the wine, and he's saying, do you want hock or claret, and things like that. So it's got like little touches that I think are interesting from a historical point of view. But like that would be the only other reason. If you were a mad Christie fan, or if you were interested in finding out more about the period. But apart from that, no, I think it's you can pass on this one.
Oh, well, that's sad to say, but I think that's very fair. So, dear listener, if you haven't read it, then maybe go away and read it if you really want to get into your Christie, but otherwise give it a miss. And stay tuned after the end credits music if you want to be spoiled. If not, we'll see you next time. Okay, so now let's get into the spoiler of how the locked room mystery was done. The key facts or the key clues are that the Lee family always holds on to a grudge and gets their revenge after years and years. And secondly, that Simeon Lee had many, many illegitimate children who look similar. And thirdly, Hercule Poirot's obsession about Superintendent Sugden's moustache. So Poirot basically figures out that Superintendent Sugden is one of Simeon Lee's illegitimate children, and that he had come to the house before the murder, actually on a pretext, had murdered Simeon Lee, set up a sort of contraption that was going to collapse and alert the house guests to the murder, and that all the blood was stored in a balloon that was burst by him pulling a string that went through the little crack in the window past that safety screw and outside. So that's how the locked room mystery was treated. We also discover that Pilar isn't who she said she is. She's passing herself off to get the inheritance. And also that Stephen Farr isn't who he said he is either. So there's a few sort of side mysteries that have to be cleared up, which is why I think Pilar sometimes is emphasizing how English her mother is, because she's trying to fit, establish herself and playing a part. But it is quite a technical and quite interesting little wheeze of how the murder's pulled off. It does rest on the idea that in a normal village shop in England, you can buy a fake joke moustache and you can buy a fake joke. What was it called? The killed pig, the dying pig balloon that emits a horrific scream as the air comes out of it, which maybe would have been more familiar to readers at the time. And we had little joke pranky toys like that when I was a kid. Back in the middle of the time. Whoopee cushions was we were obviously much more infantile in my day. But I do find the whole contraption, I do find the whole piling up all the furniture and making the big crash a little bit silly. I think if you were a vengeful son-in-law and illegitimate son, and you wanted to kill your father in cold blood, there's probably easier ways to do it than fabricating a locked room mystery just for Agatha Christie to figure out if she could get off.
I think when I was reading it, I almost got the feeling like Sugden almost straight away, like as soon as he knocked on the door, I was like, I think he's done it, because I've seen this sort of setup before, where he was the last person to see the victim alive. The room is locked, and they make a big deal about how. So I straight away I was looking at it going, I'm pretty sure he's done it. So we just see it. But as I started reading it, I was like, so I was looking for different things in it then, because then suddenly every conversation Poirot was having with Sugden was interesting, because he says quite early on, he said, I'd like to speak to people about the crime. And I was thinking back when I got to the end and thinking, well, he did speak to Sugden probably more than he spoke to anybody else. And he was always asking Sugden his opinion. It's like, how do you think this was done? Sugden, how do you see this happening? And it's almost like he says, even if people are lying to you, they're going to give away some sort of grains of truth. And as I was going through it, I was feeling like this is almost like early Columbo. We know who's done it straight up. We're just trying to find out how it's been done, and the detective is almost toying with the chief suspect just to lead them on until they've put together how it's all going to happen. So, a couple of things that I thought I wanted to discuss with you. The first one was like all the clues that are signposted, like they always talk about the facial characteristics. They've got this high bridge nose. And I thought it was quite good in the adaptation. Like I noticed all the actors who were playing the children of Simeon Lee all had these massive noses with the high bridge on them. I thought,
yeah, they cast it well, and they used a
yeah,
little bit of facial prosthetic really well.
to make
that
But
attention to detail was good.
the other thing then was the sort of psychological aspect, because this was the one thing that sort of didn't chime with me, because this is coming back to this nature versus nurture debate. And it's almost like Inspector Sugden has got the same characteristics as Simeon Lee. He's waited a long time for his revenge, because, like, they use this quote, don't they? The mills of God grind slow, but grind exceedingly small. And, that gets repeated a few times in it. And I just thought, I think, I'm not sure people are just born with that trait. I'm not sure it's not something that, they don't acquire.
Yeah, memes
life
versus
experience.
memes. Yeah, memes. I agree with you. I think that tendency to vengeance, I can imagine it be passed on in family, but I think it'd be far more through memes and behaviors. If he had lived with his father and seen him as close quarters, I maybe would have gotten it, but not for someone who's raised out the house. So I agree with you.
And Poirot's talking about how they have these they have these mannerisms that are all identical. They throw their head back and they laugh. They stroke their chin when they're thinking. And Harry Lee does it, and Simeon Lee did it, and Inspector Sugden does it. And you're like, is that right? And even Stephen Farr, spoilers, we find out that Stephen Farr is also one of Simeon Lee's sons. So I that didn't quite chime in. And that comes back to when we're talking about it being dated as well. I'm not sure that aspect of it holds up quite as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the sort of, the entire concept of sort of familial genetics and inherited traits and behaviors, I think, is weak to a modern reader, and maybe even at the time, to be frank. It's yet another reason why I don't have much more to say about this book, because I just don't find it particularly well done. And I think it's the classic case where she posed herself a puzzle and solved it, and it's kind of like, bravo, yeah, you did technically do that, but it wasn't a good book. And I think it's fascinating that not the next book, but the one after this, again, she's going to pose herself a problem that is very technical, and then there were none. And she's going to solve it in a way that is not only technically brilliant, but the characters are phenomenal. The psychology is deep. The atmosphere is just so penetrating and disturbing. And there's a reason why that book is one of the best selling of all time of any author ever, right? So this, to me, is kind of like it's a first essay. It's a book that gets her on the path to a greater book. Yeah. And it's a bridge book between, it's kind of like if you put Appointment with Death and this as kind of puzzlings out of a kind of psychology and a kind of logistics that then gets you ultimately to And Then There Were None in the darkness of World War II. I think then the context is all. And it's kind of why I love doing this linear reread, because I think even in a weaker book like this, by reading it in its order and seeing layers and references back and forth, you get more out of it.
Yeah, you're studying the evolution.
Yeah.
I've got a couple more questions for you.
Go on then.
Why did Sugden point out the key had been turned from the outside? Like, he was the first.
What an idiot! Why would he give away his own bit of?
Why is he dropping clues? And the other thing
unless it's professional pride and he can't help it through vanity, but we don't get that impression through the books. It's just silly. I think it's because Agatha Christie has to get that observation to us, but she could have done it in another way, like through Poirot, for instance. So I think that's weak.
Okay, and then the other thing is, why do we think Sugden was out to try and frame the family?
Probably maybe just resentment that they'd lived a very rich life inside the family, whereas he was outside. Yeah,
so like those were just a couple of loose ends that I had that I thought, I can put my own reading onto that, but I think the book would have benefited from a bit more of an examination.
Because it's really weird. He resents his dad, doesn't he? But we never get from Agatha that he resents the siblings, like the legitimate siblings. And like you say, that's a level of characterization that she doesn't trouble us with. I wonder if she was already kind of semi-working out or working on And Then There Were None. It's kind of interesting that the kind of the halo of books around it are definitely weaker than it. And I wonder if a lot of her brain power was consciously or subconsciously working on that.
Yeah. I made this point when we were talking about Appointment with Death as well. I got the feeling that she was working on Death in the Nile at the same time. She had these things bubbling, and she had a favourite one that she's obviously poured a lot more effort into.
And we also saw that with Orient Express. The books haloing that weren't as good. I think this is something you really get to feel. You kind of deduce it or imply it from the sort of the work output, that you can tell they're the favoured children. A bit like Simeon Lee, really.
Yes.
Okay, but anyway, I'm glad
Right.
we got to talk about it together because I think I've definitely gotten more from it, and that sort of the subtlety of the female characters being better drawn, and also, as you say about Magdalene, sort of there being something more in like reading how she's answering and how she's playing with us. That's definitely a nuance that I get from your take on it.
I thought it had little bits that interested me, scenes that interested me. But I think why I didn't enjoy this as much, as I said, was it was just more humorless, And there was a quote on the "Murder is Easy" one when they were talking about "Murder is Easy," and I just thought it just applied to this one as well. It's just the guy said that it was the William Blunt from The Observer when he was talking about "Murder is Easy." He said, "The humor and humanity of its detail raise a question which only one person can give an answer. Agatha Christie has grown accustomed to working her embroidery on a background of black. Could she or could she not leave death and detection out and embroider as well on green? I believe she is one of the few detective novelists who could, if she would let herself try, just for fun. I believe it would be good fun for other people too." So I think this guy is the same as me. When you look at Death on the Nile and you read Death on the Nile, like there's a rich tapestry of characters that are drawn there, and they have great backstories and interesting side hustles, and it's just missing from this book.
I wonder if there's two things going on here. I wonder if the lack of humor and the lack of lightness in this book is just the environment in which she was writing. Britain on the edge of war. So maybe you just lose that lightness. I wonder if again it's that taking herself to that very blackest and darkest of place that will come with And Then There Were None. That somehow she almost has to get rid of that Hastings and some of that P.G. Woodhousey silliness. There's a lot of silliness and whimsy in early Agatha Christie, and she somehow has to purge herself of that to get to the bleakness of And There Were None. And unfortunately, that process of purging gives us some rather dull, kind of not very Poirot-ish Poirot novels. The necessary casting off of that lightness of touch, and
she's gradually shedding it until she can produce something as dark as Then There Were Not and Then There Were None. But it's taking a while to get there. She's gradually, and
that's a lovely place to end, actually, because what I would say to the listener who may or may not actually be reading along with us, because it's a lot to read, if you haven't read any other Christie to this point and are just listening along at home, you will have heard us refer to And Then There Went On a lot in the previous couple of episodes. It is hands down one of her best novels, if not the best. It's hands down one of the best novels written in the 20th century of any genre. If you're going to read one novel and listen to a podcast about it, and you've got about 2 to 3 weeks to do it, please pick up And Then There Were None and give it a go, because it's really a work of art. And we'll say no more now, but I promise you that if there's one of these books you're going to read, have a read of that. And if you want another podcast on Agatha Christie and another take, then do check out All About Agatha. Thank you for joining, Pat.
No, it's a pleasure.